Bye. So good morning, everybody. I am sorry that I cannot see your faces, but feel free to pop whatever questions you have in the Q&A and we'll do our best. And then you can email questions at a later time if things come up for you. We're going to talk about transnational family reunification today. This is different than family reunification with families who've been placed in foster care or other types of separations, right? This is really what we're talking about today are families who have lived in separate countries, who have different levels of acculturation. And it is incredibly taxing work. So if you've ever worked with a family who has experienced this, it doesn't matter if it's been 6 months, 6 years, 25 years, it coming back together and sort of that reattachment process is one of the biggest challenges I have faced in my therapeutic career. And so, of course, when I find something that's hard, I tend to just double down on it. So we're going to share with you our lessons today. I'm Leila Deloria. I'm the Executive Director of Centro de Apoyo Comunitario. We are in Delaware County. We serve predominantly the Latin American community. I've been a therapist for the community in various roles at CHAP, at La Puerta Abierta for approaching 20 years, and I also do immigration-based evaluations. I'm going to let Rosa introduce herself briefly.
Hi, everybody. My name is Rosa Reynoso. I'm a family therapist, and I met Leila at La Puerta Abierta when we started working with immigrant families. I have my own history of family reunification since I separated from my family due to immigrant laws for 20 years. So I have the approach of being in the process and also the approach of working with people in the process. I collaborate at Centro de Apoyo Comunitario, but I'm also work in Philadelphia as a family-based clinical supervisor. And yes, I'm very happy to share what I learned, what I'm keep learning to this point.
All right, let's get started.
Okay. Before we check with you guys, or you check with yourself, these two important questions. What is your role when you're working with families, and what is your goal when you provide service? I just want to check real quick the fact that what is family reunification in the idea of transnational families. And one definition that kind of works is that family reunification is the process of restoring trust and connection within the family unit. As most family reunification models, it might be child-centered because the couple can be reunited, but when we talk about family reunification, we also think about the children and extended family members, so everybody in the family. The difference, like Leila just said, between what we do with transnational families is how immigration have an impact in their decisions, in their choices, and the situation that they are living. We make this very different from reunifying families due to divorce or moving from one place to another. We have to consider other factors when we think about family reunification. And this is when the question, what is your role and what is your goal, comes handy. Because these families, always come with a lot of needs, and they need a lot of support. And it's important in the idea of being a therapist. Who are you here? Because you are going to be part of this process. You're going to be within the family, but you're not part of the family. And orienting yourself to who you are in this process is going to make your job effective, working and supporting the families, but also will help you as a provider to self-regulate, because you can get really dysregulated looking at something that looks complicated, like family reunification. So if we go to what is your role, one of the things that helps is to center your purpose, your task, and your function. What I'm going to be doing here. Like in my case, I'm a psychotherapist. I'm not a lawyer. I don't know much about it. I'm not a social worker. I'm learning. I'm not a case manager, but I know a little bit. But in this work, knowing who you are and knowing your own person of the therapist is going to help you to stay focused. The other question is, are you a learner or you participant in the system? The answer can be both. I'm learning about the family and I'm working in the system, knowing that we are expert in what we do, but we are not expert in families. Family is the expert on who they are and what the things that they're being through, they're going through, how is the dynamic. They are the expert. We can be expert in advocacy, therapy, but we are not expert in the family, in the way that they have a dynamic. It's a process where we can share what we see and see how they can come up with their own answers, or they can ask us for support to find the best answer. So knowing what is your role is one part. The other piece is, what is your goal when you're doing this? And I want to slow down a little bit to give everybody a minute to think. Use this question to honestly reflect without judgment. Like, what is my goal when I'm serving in the reunification process? What I'm looking for here. Do I want to fix something because I know what happens when people get disconnected? Am I siding with the caregivers because this is most of the time the people that comes to work hard here and leave the kids over there? Or I'm siding with this child that was left behind because the parents decide to move. And I want to tell these parents, this is what you have to do now. This is how this is going to be fixed. Or I'm coming with the curiosity to see, okay, what's going on? What is the story? When we work with transnational families, we have to see different sides of the same story. And we need to provide a room for everybody comes with their understanding about this. So what is your goal? Let's say for me, my goal will be to make space and to reflect with the family. This is where you are now. This is what you can get accomplished. How can I help you? How can I support your process? I know families in these situations are used to be survivors. And sometimes that mindset of survive can stay longer, and we have to support the family to slow down and see that they are different now. And let's say as a therapist, my goal is to make space for everybody share their side of the experience and look for other supports in the eco map of this family to see how we can meet their needs. But in any case, what is your role and what is your goal has to be clear in your mind, because families can be different. You can work with 10 different families, but I'm still Rosa. I'm still the same person. And I need to know in my head, what is my role here? And what is my goal when I work with the family? I think that after that, Leila, maybe you can go to the next slide.
Thank you, Rosa. So with those two things in mind, I want to talk about some learning objectives. We're going to talk about different ways to evaluate or assess where families are. We're going to talk about some of the patterns that we've seen. That is not to say that this is not going to change. This is not an exhaustive presentation that is going to check every box. It is also to say that we are not able to provide you a roadmap for how to get a family from point A to point B, because all families have different goals, they have different experiences. And as Rosa was saying, we are not participants in the family system. We are more of, for those of you who have been interpreters in the past, we are very much in an interpretation role. You're reflecting back, you're allowing for the family to have their process. You know, at the end of your work with your family, hopefully they will have some shared goals that they're working towards. They will have some shared language, but it is not our intention to say, this is how you fix a family. So if you get that coming out of this webinar, we have not done our jobs, because this is all about process. So we're going to talk a little bit about that process. We're going to talk about what some of the roles are. We are going to spend a little time talking about coping. Coping is one of those things that we tend to assume families know that they are doing. But this process is really about highlighting that, bringing in new ways to deal with coping, and helping provide some psychoeducation on what coping actually means. And we're going to go back over and over again to what your role is. Family reunification is one of those topics that tends to inspire sort of the best and the worst of us. The best being, we want to help. You will find yourself highly motivated to help families heal. It's powerful when it happens. The flip side of that is we tend to want to save families. There are folks in the family system who will be deeply hurt. That's going to tug on our heartstrings. That's going to make us want to come in, you know, wear the white cape and do the good work. The problem is when we do that, right, we run the risk of really hurting the system, because the system has to connect within itself. It doesn't have to connect to us. Whereas I know that there's some therapeutic schools of thought that says, hey, you know, attachment with the therapist then is attachment with other folks. Yes, I agree with that at a certain point, but what is a slippery slope in this work is, you know, if you're in a family setting and folks feel that you are their sort of main point of connection, then they are not working on connection with other family roles, and how can we really develop those. This is also going to pull on your own family stories, right? Families are powerful systems, and you know, with it comes good and bad. And any family work, if any of you are family therapists, is, you know, that it's going to sort of tap into the way you feel about family generally. And so you have to watch out for that, and you have to find ways to process that outside of your family, the work with these individual families. And then we're going to talk a little bit about some of the social, cultural, and economic factors that impact this system. So there's a couple of things that we want to start with as assumptions for this conversation, right? One thing that we see a lot is sort of lay folks will make referrals and they'll say, well, you know, there's no connection in this family. They don't trust each other at all. And people tend to make blanket statements about what families are. The reality is there's some level of attachment. What it looks like is going to be highly individual, right? But the best way to test this theory is when you threaten one part of the family, you will see that there is some uproar, right? There's attachment. It might look different, and it might not be the attachment that you learned about, right? The 4 different categories that you learned about in school, but it's there. And figuring out what that looks like and really normalizing that is really critical, because that is the base. It's a process, and it's their process. You are observing the process, you're learning about the process. Again, you're very much an interpreter or sort of a guide rail of that process as a clinician, but you are not a part of the process. So if I were to sit down and interpret for you and to be part of the conversation, you would say to me, Leila, you're stepping outside your role, you're kind of getting in the way, right? Same thing with this. We want to let that be their process. We want to sort of help folks understand what's what, but we don't want to try to be a part of the process, which means we have to own our own stuff and our desire to help. And I say this having stumbled over my own 2 feet more times than you can count. I'll go in, there's somebody who I particularly like in the family group, and I find myself spending more time with eye contact and listening to them than maybe somebody in the group that I don't like so much, right? That's my stuff, and I need to get out of my own way. This is not a process where we have answers. So when folks say to you, well, what should you do? You really don't have an answer to that, because it's about the family process. And as obnoxious as people seem to find it when I say this, I still say, well, I think you need to talk about it with the other family members, right? It's not my choice. This is an extremely long process. And I say that because, as I mentioned before, I've been doing this for 20 years. I have families that I thought, this is never going to work. They're never going to speak to each other. They cannot live under the same roof. And now they are the best of friends. One family they run a business together. They live on the same block. I never in a million years thought that that would happen, but they need time. The process takes what the process takes. Ambiguity is your friend in this process. And I say that as someone who tends to be very concrete. Really allowing for silence, really allowing for not knowing the answer, that creates a gentle conflict, which can create connection. So ambiguity is your friend. And finally, you need to remember that your presence in this group is very temporary. It is the family's work to identify the village. And we'll talk more about the village in a little bit. But the village is really one of the coping goals that you need to identify. And with that, I'm going to pass it back over to Rosa to look at some of the models that we use.
Yes. When working with families, something that gets really useful is to use a model of therapy that can work. And I say model of therapy because in my role as a psychotherapist, I'm looking for something that can help me to do the best use of my time and my resource. As Leila said, our function with families is always for short time, for certain time. So like I say, providers are for what? For a little time with the family is forever. So how I can organize my work, what model of therapy can fit to families that we serve in, that can answer cultural process, trauma-informed, that is systemic, strength-based, evidence-based, because most of us, mostly in family therapy, we have to use the system to provide services and get resources for the family. In the time that I've been working with family in transitions, I found some models very useful. One of the models that I started using when I was LPA was contextual family therapy. And contextual family therapy was very useful. That's the model from Ivan Nash, because talk about relationship, talk about ethics, talk about loyalty and fairness. And one of the things that we know is that separation is not fair. What happened? But it's also a loyalty piece that keep the family connected along the way. So working with this model, you can think about how to allow for everybody to share the side of the story. When should I support one person or another within the family unit so I can bring some balance in the conversation? Because communication with families in the very beginning can be really stressful for everybody. So we kind of moderate the conversation and try to bring some sort of awareness of it is not fair, but it happens. Life is not fair, but we go through that. Eventually, as I keep working in the system, I start using ecosystemic structural family therapy. That model is a combination of structural family therapy from Salvador Minucci, but we realized that we need to consider the ecosystem. And this model of therapy, the best thing that has is that we can see the family unit, but we also can see what's around the family unit. What is the support system that they can have? Because in the process of immigration, support looks different. The support that the family that was in Dominican Republic is different from the one that is in the United States. And how we can reconfigure the support system that we need to have in place, so by the time that we leave the family, they have something solid that they can use to cope with their new circumstances. So considering the ecosystemic piece is really helpful, and using the ESFT model, ecosystemic structural family therapy, can help the clinician to connect the people, to connect the service, and leave the family with a structure that they can grow and develop as they go through their own process of living with each other again. There are other models. Well, something else that I want to say is that this ecosystemic model address attachment, is trauma-informed, is evidence-based, and is strength-based. And it's useful because when you work with families and they are using the CELES, their insurance, to get medical support or therapy, we have to use a model that is evidence-based and strength-based to provide that type of services. Another model that is not in the system but is very useful is the psychoeducational model. Psychoeducational model with these families has the advantage of touching in the acculturation process, because it's this process from assimilation, acculturation, that the families are going to be not at the same time. Let's say that the family that is here, the part of the family is here in the spectrum of the acculturation process going to assimilation is maybe high or in the middle. But the family that just coming from the other country has no idea how things look like in the United States. And helping the families to come together and grow in the process of assimilation, acculturation, is something that we can consider when we think about psychoeducational model. Other thing about psychoeducational model is that we can understand the difference between risk factors and protective factors that can have an impact in the reunification process. Mostly when we having children coming to the United States and parents trying to navigate the school system at the same time that they are navigating the legal system. And suddenly, let's say a caregiver that was here sending money back to Guatemala, is good sending the money, but then now they have to meet the teachers, and it's not the same process. They have to get used to that. Knowing what are the risks raising your children in a different ecosystem, knowing what protective factors you can have when you want to keep your kids safe or yourself safe. So psychoeducational model touch bases on what are the things that you have to consider in the reunification process. Another model, not a model, but that might be something to think about and touch bases. That's something that Leila said about ambiguity, is the concept of ambiguous loss. And this ambiguity come in the form of being connected with somebody financially, in person, or being connected with somebody emotionally. Like in this process, most of the time, you have a financial connection with a family member, and technology now is helping us to connect because we can see each other. But the emotional connection might not be present, because when you are in person or not, that make a difference. You have people that they talk to each other, that they support each other, but they are not used to be with each other. And that piece in reunification, and I want to slow down in that piece. Not being used to live with your parents or your children is not a simple thing. You can believe that, well, it's my kid. I talk to him all the time. Whatever he needs, I send it. That's what I'm here working for them. But when they come and be with you, this physical experience of being together change, because everybody somehow has an idea of who they are, but they don't have the experience of being with each other. And that can make a little bit of, not a little bit, that can bring a lot of conflict, actually, because we have different expectations and experiences, even though we believe that we are in the same page, is the same family. I remember, for example, when I finally came here and I was with my mom, my mom has this thing that she want to do things for me. She want to wash my clothes. She want to cook my meal. She want to serve me food. She want to take care of my kids, her grandkids. And I start feeling uncomfortable because I'm not used to that. I'm used to her calling me over the phone. But I'm not used to have her close to me. And I don't want to be ungrateful, but at the same time, I don't feel comfortable. And that lack of physical interaction among family members comes into reality when they are together. And you feel like, what's going on here? Because for a long time, the physical connection was absent. even though the intentions, the finances, or the thoughts were present, that connection was absent. And that have an impact in the ability of the family to reconnect. It's not very simple. So ambiguous loss is a concept. I remember Pauline Boss is the author when I read about ambiguous loss. So that can be a resource if anybody wants to know. I know that she developed that idea thinking about soldiers lost in the war and the family not knowing really if they're alive or dead. They are not here, but I don't know if they're dead. And that create an anxiety about where we at. I'm not sure. In this case, it's not about people dying, but it's the fact that we connect with people in different layers. And when one layer is absent, that can create an empty space in the relationship. And this is something that you cannot replace. You don't replace the time that they were not together. They cannot replace the time that they were not together. They know that they're missing something that happens when they were not together. They cannot bring that thing back, but they can create new spaces. They can create new memories together. And eventually, that's the healing. Knowing that we were not able to do this before, but now that we are together, we have a new chance to create a new dynamic. Being together, physically present, because that make an impact in how families connect with each other. So Leila, I mean, we can continue with the next slide.
Sure. And if I could just say a couple of things. Rosa, your example of ambiguous loss reminded me of, I was treating a teenager who said to me, she said, I was for years on the end of the phone imagining, because I would watch American movies, I was imagining what my mom looked like, and I thought she would be beautiful, and America would be beautiful. And I got here and my mom works 3 jobs and she does not look beautiful to me, and where we live is not beautiful. And the loss of that idea was so powerful for this young person that, you know, we had to spend some serious time on that, because that was the world that she was aspiring to and made the journey to be in, and got here, and that's not what it was. So ambiguous loss is present in every aspect of this work. So thank you for bringing that up. The other thing that I wanted to mention is these models, all of the models that we are taught do a terrible job at looking at immigrant families. They just don't. And, you know, if you read the research, it all says, well, yes, you know, it doesn't account for cultural factors. And there's a lot of reasons for that. But at the end of the day, right, just, you know, I only speak one other language, which is Spanish, so I tend to work in that language the most. The diversity within the Spanish-speaking community is so massive. I couldn't even begin to think about how you start to look at that. So what you want to do is start to get creative when you're thinking, okay, yes, you're going to use ESFT, you're going to think through the models of attachment, you're going to take a trauma history, you're going to do some psychoed and normalize the stages of reunification. You have those tools at your disposal, but you also want to know from the family, you know, what are some of the cultural messages that you're bringing to the table? Can you read, you know, up on Cecilia Falakov's work? Can you read, are there Spanish-speaking therapists who've written on these topics? Are there, you know, in my particular case, or are there therapists from any of these home countries that talk about immigration. So there's definitely, you want to do your research if you're going to work with a population and not just base it on what we're taught in the US, because it will be deficient. It's just the nature of it. So a couple of things to think about in patterns and assessment of reunification. And I broke this down parent to child, but most certainly it could be aunts and uncles receiving a young person in their home. It could be a sponsor, right? So a community member from a hometown receiving a child. So this could look different depending on the context of the family. But what you have to understand is initially, what will always happen is a honeymoon phase, right? The child arrives, they're either sent by immigration or they somehow miraculously get to the community without being picked up, whatever that looks like. And everyone's happy to see each other, right? They might be happy, they might be unhappy, right? It's very much a crisis, but not necessarily a negative crisis, right? And why crisis, I just mean there's a lot of moving parts happening all at the same time. And so everyone tends to be on their best behavior because they want to make this work. Now that could last months, that could last weeks, that could last days. It's really a matter of, so what I always, if we have the luxury of knowing that a child is going to arrive, I do this psychoed on the front end of this. And I say, your child's going to show up and they're going to be on their best behavior. And then the parent comes back to me and they say, but it's amazing. All those things you said about, the ups and downs, they're not true, and I'm like, that's great. I just want you to know. And then things shift. And that's okay. Because if folks have the luxury of knowing beforehand, things will shift. It feels less traumatic when they do shift, because they will. And so what we want people to understand is the honeymoon phase is not that, it's not anyone's being fake. It's really a reattachment phase, right? It's a phase where we can be together, but things are going to change out of that, and that's normal. From the parent or caregiver perspective, what we want folks to understand is they have to start to think about what their norms are for establishing parental discipline, power, structure, and different folks act differently depending on what they learn, depending on how they're feeling. But what I see a lot of is family members who feel intensely guilty, intensely shamed by the fact that they were forced to leave a child, and a real desire to make up for it by being overly giving or to be overprotective and really sort of clamp down, so that the reaction tends to be a little bit extreme. So I think to work with a parent to say, are you doing this because you're trying to make up for something? Are you doing this because you're very scared? Let's start to think about some of the reasons and what the developmental needs, right? A 5-year-old's going to behave very differently than a 13-year-old. What developmentally does this child need, just on a developmental level? And then how do you want to handle some of this? So we want to take into consideration the culture. If the parent's been here for 20 odd years, they're going to look culturally very different than someone who's been here for 6 months. And what does that look like? If the child has come 3 years ago and been in an American school for years and speaks English, they're culturally going to look very different than a child who's been here for a week. And really looking at that and seeing what that means. Parents need to understand that children who are growing up in a different culture are not going to hold the same cultural norms, because of differentiation, right? I mean, if I tell my kids to do anything, they will do the complete opposite because they're teenagers. That's the way they work. But also B, because their community, their developmental community, are other teenagers, and those may be Americans, they may be other immigrant groups that the family never anticipated having as a part of their community. It can really vary. So they need to understand that children in acculturate just very differently. And we want to normalize the parent's sense of grief, right? The loss of being able to be physically present for their child. It's a loss that takes a long time. And I still have yet to meet a parent for whom this is not one of the most profound and painful feelings that they have to deal with on a day-to-day basis. And that can manifest in anger, and there's definitely a lot of shame. And so working with the parents about what's your narrative about what you did, what is your narrative about why you needed to do this, and really normalizing that we know they did the best they could, right? But helping them find the language to describe that. Looking at the patterns of communication of families is really, really critical. And especially jumping to the last one, permission to discuss feelings. So there's a lot of, well, if I don't say anything negative, then it's not happening. And as younger folks acculturate differently, right? They learn, no, actually, we're going to talk about this, but the parents may not be ready, or vice versa. And so looking at those patterns of communication, are you only talking about happy things? Because I'm going to argue that any families that are only discussing things that make everybody happy, are not getting at some of the points of connection where they could be embracing and supporting one another. And they're definitely not tapping into what one another needs, which is a critical area of communication that needs to be discussed. What do you need? To Rosa's earlier example, do you need me to watch your kids? Do you need me to hug you all the time? Do you need me to take care of you physically? Do you need that? Or do you need some space? What are those needs? And those needs will change. We want to make sure that all parents have their own support systems, and that they have, to the extent possible, support of extended family. I struggle with the concept a little bit of extended family, and one of the reasons why is because communities define families in very different ways. And I think when we say in the US extended family, we start to think about uncles and grandparents and aunts and what have you, and we're a little prescriptive about it. I have in my family folks to which I am no biological relation whatsoever, but they are definitely a part of my extended family. So allow for families to tell you who their support systems are, who their extended families are. Children go through similar honeymoon phases, right? They will establish autonomy in the way that is developmentally appropriate for them. Young kiddos can, be physically very rejecting, or extremely clingy at times. This is all a part of the process while they work out what feels good. But recognizing that they're constant, all of these points of friction that's the process of reattachment, right? If they don't go through these difficult times, they're not actually reattaching. So all of that tension and that friction is for a greater good, as painful as it is to go through. But if you've ever sort of worked with clay, you don't stick two flat pieces of clay together and hope that they stick. You've got to scratch it. You've got to get in there and get it good and muddy and scratched up. And that's how you stick those together. Reattachment's not that different. So it's, while I'm not going to say, oh, holding therapy is a wonderful tool. I wouldn't ever suggest anyone use it. The reattachment process is messy, and we have to allow for those tense moments, for those difficult moments, so that people can come together. We want to recognize the loss. I know a lot of young people who describe their feelings of loss are animals. If, I know a young man who raised horses, and the ability to not work with horses or animals has been extremely painful because he lives in the city and that's just not something that he can do. So whatever those feelings of grief, anger, and loss are, we want to just recognize them for what they are. We also want to look at the sibling relationship. If there are siblings that are still in home country, what does that mean for the young person? If there are American-born siblings, what does that mean for the young person? If we have an older teen coming and they resent, a toddler sibling, it's okay that they have those feelings of resentment, those feelings of jealousy. It's just a normal part of the process. But by and large, folks won't, what teenager is going to say, I reject this baby, but it happens and it's normal. If siblings who are, never separated reject each other, why wouldn't siblings who are reunifying do the very same? And then explore with the young folks, what permission do you have to share your feelings? And what language do you have to share your feelings? In many situations, folks, phone calls, right, are not tackling heavily emotional language. It's, what were your grades like? Or how are things going? Or, what was this? Who are your friends? But that's not heavy emotional language. So do folks have the words? And how can they, sit with one another while they're doing that? And I know that we're going to get to the Q&A in a moment, but feel free to put any questions you have in the Q&A. I can't monitor it, so I don't know if they're in there or not already. My apologies. So Rosa's going to talk a little bit about the village and what that means. And then we'll get into other coping. So I'm going to turn it back over to you, Rosa.
Yes, but before going to the village, I just want to reinforce something that Leila was explaining very nicely from the past slide, that it is cornerstone too, which is to make the difference, to see the difference between behaviors and emotions. Because emotions come in form of a behavior. The behavior, you can see it. And you see this child being really angry at you. And your go-to might be working in the anger. You're not supposed to, or yes, you can, or cope with the anger that you see in the form of a behavior. But having in mind that when you see a kid, I don't want to go to school. I don't speak English. I don't feel comfortable. I'm not going, I'm not going, I'm not going. And you see that behavior and you say, yes, you go. You're here, you're going to be successful, you got to go to school, but I don't want to go to school. And you stay in this back and forward. I don't want to go to school. I don't like these kids. They are bullying me. They are looking at me funny. I don't want to talk. And you keep going, but yes, you have to go. It doesn't matter. You're here to be successful. You are at this behavioral phase. And supporting the family to come down to, he's not oppositional. He's angry, he's sad. And working on that sadness, working on the loss, that he's still grieving, that he left his grandma or his friends back in town. That's the goal. Because changing behavior can, things can do a little bit better when the behavior change, but if the emotion is not addressed, the behavior was gonna keep coming back and coming back. And sometimes we go fast thinking that right now I gotta go to work and I cannot stay here talking about how you feel. Just go to school. it might backfire. So supporting the families to address the feeling that comes in form of behavior, because that's going to be like a long-lasting solution. It's not about fixing this behavior right now. I will have to slow down and see that this kid is sad. And actually, parents that get upset because they are upset, one way for them to decrease and regulate is not thinking about your opposition. You're disrespectful. You might be thinking, you should be really sad right now. And I'm so sorry. I know you miss your friends back in Guatemala. But guess what? Maybe you can make your friends. But slowing down the fast thinking, because you have to go to work and they have to go to school and you need your job and they need their school. That fast thinking sometimes can be trapping the families not to make progress. So all these concepts about acknowledging the feelings is with a purpose, because when the feeling is acknowledged and discussed, the behavior follow. All the way around, you just butt heads and get more angry. So have a consideration of acknowledging the feelings in the way that you can do it. Everybody has a different situation, but knowing that the behavior is a manifestation and working in the feeling have more chances to change the behavior than just giving new directions before, things are a little bit more calm. So coping with the cornerstone of process, develop the village. All of us come with a timeline to support the family, all of us. And in the reunification process, as fast as we can identify the village, and when I say the village, I'm talking about the support system. What is the village here? What this family needs to sustain progress? That might be a lawyer, that might be school system, that might be food banks, that might be church, that may be the playground. How we can assist this family to create their own village. Like, for example, kids that come from farms or from the, mountains or different places. Now they're in Philadelphia city. And there is not the same space. They're all living in a small house. How the village is going to look like for them. Maybe we need to quickly identify a playground in the area. But has to be tailor-made. The village is the family's village. It can be people that is here. Sometimes how to stay connected with people left behind. That can also be part of your village in the transitional time. But the idea is, as providers, we start working, like we say, we start working in this charge from the very beginning. We are not going to be with them forever. We can be with them as long as we want. But part of the systemic process for them to be strong and reconnected is that they can work in the developing of their own village. What are the things that they can do together, or what is the plan, who they can call to support each other? Who is the next person? It might be a neighbor, it might be a provider, it might be something for everybody. Mom can start going to Zumba classes. The kids start playing soccer. Or the village is something that we start from the beginning with the idea that we are going to be out. And they need to have their own way to develop in the community.
Thank you. And I think I'm just going to piggyback on what Rosa's saying here. Many folks will initially sort of, when you say, who supports you, their interpretation will be, well, they mean either biological family or people who I can rely on economically. That's one of the answers that I get sort of right away. And so you need to develop some questions to ask around to figure out, well, what do you do when you're not at work, right? Who do you talk to when you're bothered and you need help discussing something? What are some things that you do that make you feel relaxed or like you have some breathing room? And that's how you start to get at who the village is. And it's also how you start to evaluate what coping mechanisms the family has. Now, I don't know many folks who are appreciative of me sort of coming into a session and saying, well, let's make a list of your coping mechanisms. But I do find that folks are very open to when they give me an example of something that's working well for them, to my feedback of, it sounds like you handled that very well using this, that, or the third way of coping with the situation. So how you start to incorporate coping language is really important. Most of the families that I work with do not appreciate lists, handouts. I've just not had a lot of success with it. You may. There's nothing, I don't see any harm in trying, but I think the dynamic flow of discussing, you tried something new and you might feel better, or you might have just maintained through a hard spot. It looks like you did this, that, or the third, right? You went out for a walk. You called someone to watch your kid for 10 minutes so that you could go to the store by yourself. Whatever those things are that allow you to deal and get space and breathing room, we call them coping mechanisms. And the reason why we do that is because it's about getting that space that Rosa referred to, slowing down so that you are not reacting. You're not behaving as a reaction to your emotions, right? You're creating that pause. And when our physical, verbal reaction is simply whatever's top of mind, that emotional process, right? That's where we can highlight, hey, could you try this? Could you try that? Could you try the third? We need to be very careful with families that we don't hold out coping as something that makes everything better. It doesn't, right? And as I say this, it probably makes sense to everyone on this webinar that coping doesn't have to be positive, but I think we have to tell families that, because sometimes when we say things like coping, people think that's supposed to make them happy. And I think we have to be super specific and say, it can be just getting through it, and that's okay. As long as it's sort of that break, that pause, that recognition of, emotionally, I feel this way, but these are the things that I need to do right now. That's coping. And you, through the course of your work, will work on all of the ways. And I know that most folks know I didn't bother to list coping mechanisms, because I know you know many and you can highlight more. But for a lot of parents, right, work is coping. It's space away from the kids. So did you take on a second job because you don't want to deal with your kid? That is a coping mechanism. But how are you going to then go back and tackle some of the content that you need to tackle with your young person? How are you creating that space, but then coming back together so that you can tackle some of the difficulty? The reunification process is all about time. And when I say time, I mean, we really need to be patient with the fact that this can take years and years. I've families that I know who are still actively engaged in the process 10 years later. And they're managing, they're coping. There's attachment there. There's a lot of positivity, but we just need to respect that it does take much longer than we think that it will. I'm going to move on to the next one because I want to For some reason, it won't advance, and I'm not sure why. All right, technological fail, y'all. So before I stop share, and I think the conference will send you out the slides, we wanted to talk briefly about you in the room. And we do have a slide, but it won't show. So we want you to start to see your role as scaffolding. And I'm looking away because I have a printed version of it here. Your role needs to account for the fact that you are going to leave the group. If it's after 6 sessions, if it's after 16 or 60 sessions, you will eventually exit the group. And you need the group to function in whatever way they have chosen to function. We don't want the group to be looking to us and then be struggling to talk to one another after we leave the room. The beautiful slide we created but can't show shows a coxswain and a rowing team, right? Because what those folks do on the team is provide motivation and safety and talk about the strategies that support the team. They're not actually rowing, right? So they are the folks that help set the pace and the tone. And in those sessions, you very much are in the seat where you can say, okay, I heard somebody say this, and you just sort of glanced over it. Let's go back. Let's pause. Let's sit. Somebody is clearly struggling and is in pain. Can we just sit? Is there anything that you would like to offer them? Is there anything that they would like to receive as a part of this process, right? You're very much that guidepost. You're providing the safe environment. You are not rowing, if that makes any sense. Recognize that you're not an expert. I think many of us in mental health have been afforded a status that, for better or worse, we may not have. It's our job to stay curious, and it's our job to recognize that the family is the expert on themselves. We can know all the theories in the world, but people come in to my office all the time and they say, "Hi, doctor." I'm not a doctor, right? "Hi, attorney." I'm not an attorney, right? But they afford me the status that I don't have, don't want, and don't have. And so the conversation then is, not only am I not a doctor, but I'm not you, and I don't live in your house. And you are the experts on your own lives. And that's a conversation we have repeatedly over and over and over again. I personally have to question my motivation and my intention at all times. And I say this because family therapy, especially transnational family therapy, it's, and I think I said this earlier, is really ripe for folks to come in ready to save the unit, right? The community that I work in tends to be extremely deferential to providers, and it's very easy to lose myself in that process when they say to me, "What do you think?" And, accept that deference as more than it is. And really being intentional and saying, "I don't know. And that's not my role. What do you think?" is the thing that's going to help the family and support the family. Because language discrimination, because racism is so a part of our family's experience, right? Folks are taught that they don't know, or that their opinions are not as important. And so a part of the process really has to be, but you do know, and you know better than I do, and I'm learning from you, and let's learn from each other. And the last thing is, you want to find support. Transnational family reunification, especially if it ties into your own personal history in any way, is extremely challenging. And any family therapy, right, will bring up stuff from our own families, which are powerful systems. So we need to be super careful. about what we're bringing into the room and what seat we're sitting in. And making sure that we are not the person who's trying to drive the bus, right? We're not the person who's trying to row the boat. We are the person who's a guidepost. We're trying to maintain safety. We're trying to keep the process going, and we share what we do to help that process along. Rosa, I want to ask if you have anything to add before we start to tackle the questions.
Well, just to remarks a little bit, the person of the provider, the person of the therapist, who are you in the room? Just to acknowledge that we are here and we also go to this parallel process. Like let's say, maybe because we have history as immigrants, or maybe because we don't know anything about immigration, but we feel like we want to do something that we see is not fair. You can be either side of the board and try to come into the middle. But just for all of you, including Layla and me, just remind ourselves that this is tough work, and our own self-care is as important, because the idea is that we can continue providing longer and taking care of ourselves in the process, so we can have the strength to do what we do. It's not optional. Self-care is not something that I can do if I have time, but if I can. I constantly reach out to my village. I say, Layla, this is what's going on. I understand what's going on here. How can I do this or that? I feel this way. I don't understand, even working with people that looks like me and sometimes talk like me, but we are not the same. We're all different. Self-care is not optional or something that you can do when you have the chance. Self-care is part of the process. How you enrich yourself, slow down, and reframe the way you see things when it's needed, and call the next person that you trust to do the reframe and say, wait a minute, maybe I don't have the right perspective here. I'm inducted in this process. I'm too close to the heat. And when we are too close, our vision shrink. Sometimes we need to step back so we can see the whole picture. Sometimes we cannot do this by ourselves. I need Layla. Layla, pull me out of this, because this is, I'm getting tired. And taking care of ourselves is very important, and we cannot just delay that. This is part of what we do, taking care of ourselves.
All right. Thank you, Rosa. Now with that, I'm going to stop the share, and with apologies that we could not show you the last slide. And I see Naseri. Nice to see your name. Will this webinar be sent after today? I went ahead and asked them to send it as a PDF. I am not certain what the conference plans are, but they certainly have it and are, I think, hoping to send that out. Are there other questions? Rachel, I see a yes, but I'm not sure if I'm what that's, if you had another question that's attached to that, or if other folks on the webinar have questions that they want to put in the chat. I also don't know if it's updating or not, frankly, but how are we addressing monolingual families? I'm not certain that I understand the question. Do you mean families that only, I wish we had a chat and not a question and answer. Monolingual families, in terms of if the family speaks the same language, we try to really get curious about what that is and how we are tackling it. Let me see. Hold on. Okay, got you. I will say, while we wait for Naceti to type, and apologies for the clumsy system, language difference within families is absolutely massive. I have multiple families where the parents might speak an indigenous language, both parent and child speak Spanish, child might speak English. It is not uncommon for kids to try to use their other language as a way to get out of, cut the parents out of the conversation. And, that I just address head on. And I say, well, we all want to be a part of this conversation. And I really am pretty direct about it. But I find parents, yes, parents who speak Spanish and children who speak English due to the separation. If the family really does not speak the same language at all, obviously that creates its own barriers, but I think calling it out and figuring out how are they managing in the day-to-day, how do they talk to each other? Obviously that will start to change, right? One person will start to speak to the other person, but I think one thing that's really important to bring up is our bias in society about Spanish. Right? We have, and I say this not because I think it, I say it because we tend to think of English as the language to speak. And folks, they really feel that on a deep level. And it's important that we start to appreciate the richness of other languages and the power of being bilingual, and all that comes with that. And that is an education piece, I think, for family members who may not speak the language that is seen as the other language, whether it be Spanish, whether it be another language. But I also think, helping the parents who don't speak the more dominant language, in this case, English, helping them feel their power in other ways. Obviously, if they want to learn the language, then, we hope that that's something that they have the access to do. And the case manager in me says, let's help them do that. But it shouldn't be required of anybody. And there's a lot of reasons why families don't speak that language, but there's ways that they can feel powerful in their language. And setting that tone in familial structures where it's like, this is the language that we're going to speak, then, if the child understands but can't speak it, then what did you understand? And really checking for comprehension and making that a part of the session is what I would say. Yes, and Nilcetti says, I have families where parents works from 5 to 10, children don't get to be exposed to Spanish, and the children learn English but not Spanish. Yes, absolutely. And the situation around work is certainly its own topic, right? With immigrant families and not having the same access to work or work rights as other folks, what that means and what that means for the kiddos that they are raising is a difficult topic. But I think it's really important that we call out the things that we're seeing, right? And we find ways for families to come together to start to come up with some solutions to those things. I don't know, Rosa, did you have thoughts?
I think this is a good example to go back to the first question. What is my role? What is my goal? What do I need to do here? How I can put the dilemma in the families, in the parents' hands back? Because like you say, well, parents are working all day, kids at school, at the end of the day, they speak different language. What is my role here? To tell the parent, this is what I see. Your work schedule doesn't allow for you and your child to communicate enough so you can have a unified language, let's say. So what you guys can do, what the mom can do, because even though you might not speak English, you speak mom. Motherhood is a language. And what is the motivation will bring the words together. I know families that, as you say, one person do not speak English but understand, one child don't speak Spanish but understand everything that you say in Spanish. They just don't talk, they just don't say it, but they understand everything that you said. So providing for this family, give back to the caregiver. How can you kind of work in this situation? That's not the provider. I mean, we can give suggestion, we can share what we see and have the courage to say it. Because sometimes we see stuff that we don't feel like we should be saying. And our job is to see and share what we see with courage. This is what I see. If you work all the time, I'm not saying that you don't have to work. Just see that that might be a barrier. And we turn back that to the original owner, which is parents and children. How you guys are gonna, and they will figure it out. But that's the idea, that we stand in what is my role, what is my goal. There are things that I don't know, there are things that I cannot fix, I cannot help, but I can tell you what I see, and I'm gonna have the courage to say it the way I see it, so you can make your choices, make your adjustments.
Thank you, No City, for the question. I am aware that we only have one more minute and y'all get a 10-minute break before the next session. So what I would say is, if you want to reach out to NSC, we're happy to answer questions over email, if that would be helpful. And I will definitely ask Gwen what her plan is about sending out the PDF of the slides. I just appreciate everyone. I appreciate you being willing to think about this with us today. And yeah, I hope the rest of the conference is lovely. With that, I'm going to attempt to exit the space, but if you know how to do that better than I, by all means, go ahead.
Thank you.
Thank you.